Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. So today we're tackling one of the most profound, eternal tugs of war in human history. I'm talking about that delicate and honestly heavily debated balance between the free market and government intervention. It's a completely fascinating dynamic, and it literally shapes every single aspect of our daily lives, right down to the price of the coffee you drank this morning and the safety of the roads you drive on. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking at the invisible hands limits, then uncover when free markets fail, and examine the risks of government intervention. After that, we'll look at tools for smart regulation, and finally wrap up with valuing the invaluable. Section 1. The invisible hands limits. Let's start with Adam Smith's utopian ideal. Way back in the 18th century, Adam Smith argued that self-interest basically guides the market like an invisible hand. And when that hand works perfectly without a central planner getting in the way, we reach something called Pareto efficiency. Now, this is a state where resources are allocated so perfectly that you literally cannot help one person without hurting another. In theory, highly competitive markets achieve this efficiency by perfectly balancing the marginal benefit to society with the marginal cost to production. Sounds pretty amazing, right? Well, there's a catch, and it's a big one. For this perfect efficiency to actually exist, the market requires some really rigid assumptions. We're talking perfectly informed buyers, a huge number of small firms with absolutely no monopolies, and zero spillover effects, meaning absolutely zero pollution. Obviously, these textbook conditions rarely, if ever, exist in the real world. And that right there sets the stage for why government intervention becomes absolutely crucial. Section 2. When free markets fail. Let's move on and see how this shatters the utopian ideal. So, one of the main reasons free markets drop the ball is due to something called externalities. Let's unpack that economic jargon a bit. Essentially, externalities happen when private actions spill over and affect innocent bystanders. A transaction happens between a buyer and a seller, sure, but a third party who had absolutely nothing to do with it ends up paying a price or reaping a reward. Think of it like two sides of a coin. On the negative side, you have things like factory pollution or secondhand smoke. The market doesn't naturally account for the cost to public health, which inevitably leads to an overproduction of harm. But on the positive side, we have things like community vaccinations or building a new public park. Here, society benefits massively. But because private companies can't capture all the profit from those benefits, the free market naturally leads to a major undersupply of these social goods. Now, you might be wondering about other ways the market fails. Well, ask yourself this. Would you pay absolute top dollar for a used car? If you're like most of us, your answer is probably a very hesitant no way. And why? Because you don't know the car's true history like the seller does. This brings us to the fascinating problem of imperfect information. Economist George Akerlof actually modeled this in his famous Market for Lemons. It's like a chain reaction, because buyers can't verify if a used car is a genuinely good car, a peach, or a total lemon. They automatically lower their price offers just to play it safe. But because the offers are so low, the sellers of the actual peaches refuse to sell and just leave the market entirely. So what happens? Eventually, only the bad cars remain. It perfectly illustrates how bad products inevitably drive out the good ones when buyers and sellers aren't equally informed. Section 3. Risks of government intervention. Let's see what happens when the pendulum swings toward state control. Okay, so the market clearly fails. But bringing in heavy government control introduces an entirely new set of headaches. Because let's be real, governments fail too. Politicians and bureaucrats aren't omniscient. Government failures pop up all the time through bureaucratic inefficiency, rent-seeking, which is where groups lobby for unfair financial perks, and regulatory capture. That's when the industries being regulated actually gain control over the agencies that are supposed to be policing them. So yeah, state interventions can be just as flawed as the markets they're trying to fix. This is brilliantly illustrated when we look at India and South Korea back in the mid-20th century. Both countries used heavy government investment planning to grow their economies, but their execution was vastly different. India relied really heavily on bureaucratic rationing and strict licensing, which unfortunately led to some pretty wasteful inefficiencies. South Korea, on the flip side, utilized market-oriented financial incentives to guide private industrialists. And the outcome? It fostered dynamic industrial growth. It just goes to show that the success of government intervention relies entirely on the regulatory execution. Regulators also have to figure out where the power should actually set.
Keeping it centralized, like with federal agencies, creates a lot of uniformity and a level playing field, but it can be incredibly slow and totally ignore local needs. Decentralizing that power to local entities is highly flexible and promotes competition. But the downside is it can spark transboundary conflicts. Think pollution drifting across state lines, and a literal race to the bottom where regions just slash regulations to attract more business.
Section 4. Tools for smart regulation. Finding that optimal middle ground.
So the goal of smart regulation isn't to completely destroy free markets. Actually, scratch that. It's about fixing them. Regulators are really trying to replicate the outcomes of a perfectly competitive market. They use targeted tools to eliminate monopolies and excess profit incentives, all while ensuring that broad social welfare, things like public health and infrastructure, is being actively addressed.
One of the absolute best tools for this is the public-private partnership, or PPP. Instead of the government awkwardly trying to build everything itself, the public sector simply identifies a need. Then the private sector steps in with the financing, the tech expertise, and the innovation. Finally, the public sector maintains the regulatory oversight. Prime examples of this working beautifully are the massive upgrades to the London Underground and the whole Delhi metro system. It perfectly solves that free rider problem we see with public good.
Beyond partnerships, regulators use some really clever modern mechanisms to shape behavior. By slapping environmental taxes on pollution, they make it financially painful to pollute. By offering subsidies, they encourage private firms to invest in things we desperately need, like renewable energy. They also use competitive public franchising, which basically forces companies to bid against each other for the right to operate a local monopoly, like a rail line. It's a smart way to incentivize private firms to act in the public interest without needing a clumsy, total government takeover.
Section 5. Valuing the invaluable. This is where we get into the incredibly difficult math of social cost-benefit analysis.
To decide if a new safety regulation is actually worth the cost, governments are literally forced to put a dollar amount on human life. I know it sounds a bit cold, but they use a metric called the value of a statistical life, or VSL. Economists use a revealed preference approach, looking at exactly how much extra pay people demand to take on riskier jobs. By measuring that, governments can estimate the economic benefit of saving lives to weigh against the cost of the safety rules. It is highly controversial for sure, but right now it's the standard tool we've got.
Another absolutely massive factor in this math is the social discount rate. In many governments, including the US, the standard rate sits right around 7%. This single number is used to weigh the costs we pay today against the societal benefits we're going to receive in the future. But when you start dealing with really long-term issues, this number becomes highly debatable. To put that into perspective, simply tweaking this percentage completely alters our reality. If you use that standard 7% discount rate, a $100 benefit to society a century from now shrinks to a present value of just 12 cents. It literally makes long-term environmental protection look financially worthless today. But if you drop that rate down to 1%, which is sometimes used for climate change, suddenly that exact same $100 is worth over $35 today. Changing this one little lever totally transforms how governments value future generations.
And then, of course, we have to place a value on nature itself. Take the massive Exxon Valdez oil spill, for example. The courts didn't just look at the lost income of the local fishermen. They used a method called contingent valuation, actually surveying the public to account for the perceived emotional loss of that pristine natural environment. That single calculation resulted in a staggering $1 billion compensation figure, just for the environmental damage. So all of this really leaves us with a profound question to think about. Is it truly possible to put a precise price tag on a human life or the natural environment? Economics tries its best because, well, it has to in order to make policy. But the math is always going to be a delicate balancing act. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.